Welcome back to my channel. I'm continuing where I left off the last time. We're talking about conservative scholars and Dr. Michael Licona's views specifically on the Gospel of John. Something that he's been doing recently in interviews is associating widely respected conservative scholars with his own views, including D.A. Carson, whom I'm going to be focusing on today, and specifically with his more controversial views, although usually not naming those controversial views in a clearly stated set of terms in that vicinity. But in the context, he'll be talking about, people who disagree with his views on John, people who find his views on John controversial or even extreme. And then he'll make broad statements like, these conservative people are saying this stuff, they've known these things for a long time, and so forth. So the very strong implication is that if you consider Dr. Licona's views, specifically on the Gospel of John, to be seriously wrong, or even extreme, etc., then you would also think that about these other scholars' views concerning the Gospel of John. So, you're sort of up against everybody, including people you thought were on the conservative side. That's the very strong implication in the context in these interviews. Now, I read a quotation from an interview last time. Here's from another interview. This is one with Tim Stratton. You have D.A. Carson, who says that Jesus in John is so similar to John in 1 John that we can conclude that John has taken and rewritten Jesus's words in the whole. And then later, that's W-H-O-L-E. And then later in the same interview, remember, D.A. Carson, nobody is going to say D.A. Carson is a liberal. Nobody is going to say that. And yet, Carson says that John has rewritten the whole. That's a quote. Okay, so he's saying, that's a quote. Carson says, John has rewritten the whole. So this is supposed to associate Carson with views that Dr. Licona holds concerning John that someone might think are liberal views. Okay? And we talked last time about arguments from authority and treating the definition of liberalism as being indelibly tied to particular scholars and just all the rhetorical things that are going on here. Patronizing people who disagree by saying that they struggle or find difficult to accept these views, not just that they disagree, using success verbs like know. These scholars have known these things, known this stuff for a long time, and then specifically saying that if you strongly disagree with his views, it's probably because it's new to you, because you don't read the academic literature and the commentaries. And so the implication being you should just leave it to the experts, and all the experts, or virtually all the experts, including these iconic conservatives, agree with him. Okay, now I also want to review now some specifics, okay, that are the actual issues between Dr. Licona and myself, and Dr. Licona and others who have been alerted to his views and who disagree with them. So let's get down to some specifics, not just talk about this stuff or these things. John invented the saying, I thirst, from the cross. John invented Jesus saying, it is finished, from the cross. And inventing I thirst includes indicating that the people around heard it as a physical cry of thirst. John may have theologized history in reporting Jesus' discourses. It is impossible to know how far John went in adapting Jesus' teachings. There is reason to doubt that Jesus recognizably said before Abraham was I am, on the grounds that Jesus avoided making explicit claims for his own messiahship. And then Dr. Licona will say, well, it doesn't matter anyway if this was, theologized history in John, because we've got so much high Christology in the synoptics. Anyway, Either John and Luke or Matthew and Mark relocated the first appearance of Jesus to his disciples from Galilee to Jerusalem or vice versa. So in other words, John may have pretended that Jesus first saw his disciples in Jerusalem when actually he knew that he first saw them in Galilee, which would change the whole circumstances. John invented Jesus breathing and saying, "Receive the Holy Spirit," in that meeting he had with his disciples. So that's a whole sub-incident. Then there will just be these random, this is something I didn't mention last time, random questioning of sayings of Jesus and saying, it's impossible to know. Did Jesus say this historically? So in one of Dr. Licona's videos back in 2020, responding to my book, he said something positive about the historicity of Jesus' words. My kingdom is not as this world, in talking to Pilate, but then went on right away to say that when Jesus says, "Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice," speaking to Pilate, that it's impossible to know if he historically said that. Now, there's no particular argument against that saying. It was just this random, by the way, when we get a couple verses on and he says this, I don't know if Jesus historically said that, even though he just admitted that we have reason to think that Jesus historically said, "My kingdom is not of this world." I mean, this isn't just a passage-by-passage approach. We could call this a sentence-by-sentence approach. Like every sentence Jesus says in John, has to meet this burden of proof. No concept of the reliability of John that puts the burden of proof the other way, that you would have to have some argument that Jesus didn't say that. Randomly suggested there that this may be John putting in Jesus' mouth on another occasion something similar to "My sheep hear my voice," which John records in chapter 10. So that he just decided to act like Jesus said something else similar to that without historical warrant. So that really has implications. Whatever may be said to the contrary, in practice that shows a certain attitude toward John's reliability. And it's not a strong attitude toward John's reliability, not a high evaluation when John's reportage of something can't even shift the burden of proof, and instead we just have to be agnostic. It's impossible to say if Jesus historically recognizably said that. So these are some specifics, and I've not just argued, it's terrible, this isn't conservative, but I've argued that these are false, that we should think of John, we have evidence to think of John as being historically reliable, and these various fact-changing things are false. But we need to keep that clear in mind as to what kind of controversial views are under consideration and under discussion here. My disagreements with Dr. Licona are not about conjunctions in Greek and the frequency with which John uses certain conjunctions in reporting Jesus' sayings. That's not what this is about. So now let's look at that quotation from D.A. Carson. John has rewritten the whole. Okay, I'm backing up a little from it. This is from the Gospel According to John, Kindle edition, pages 26 to 27. Students of Greek, perhaps more readily than those who read the text only in translation, observe that the style of writing is quite different from that of the synoptics. For instance, the vocabulary is smaller. There is frequent parataxis, the use of coordinate clauses, instead of subordinating expressions, which elegant Greek much prefers, peculiar uses of pronouns, e.g. ekainos, that one, frequently no more than he in John, and many instances of a syndeton, simply laying out clauses beside each other without connecting them with particles or conjunctions as Greek prefers. More importantly, there is little discernible difference in style between the words that are ascribed to Jesus and the evangelist's own comments. John has rewritten the whole. So, and by the way, I discussed this stuff, a syndeton and so forth, in The Eye of the Beholders. That's not news, okay? But in the immediate context, Carson is just talking about style. Now you may say, well, okay, maybe he is just talking about style there, but maybe if we keep going, we're going to find that Carson actually has some broader view that John may have changed some historical things. After all, sometimes Dr. Licona talks about style, but then extrapolates from that to a broader view about John historically changing some things. So I'm not going to rest my case that Dr. Licona is misusing Dr. Carson just on the immediate context of that quotation. There's a lot more to be said. So let's go and look at specific concrete issues, okay, of concern to critical scholars, where Dr. Licona takes the position that John has changed something, and I disagree with that. Other people who agree with me disagree with that, and see what Carson thinks about those issues. And it's just going to be check, 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 issue after issue, that Dr. Carson takes the conservative side of that. Okay, so there is no broader extrapolation beyond style. All right, I thirst. Carson never even worries about that some ideas, as Dr. Licona said in these recent interviews, that there would be some kind of contradiction and you shouldn't try to harmonize John and the synoptics because you should count backwards from Jesus' death, and the saying reported in John that's the second to the last needs to be lined up with the second to the last saying in the other Gospels. He doesn't even get into that, and he clearly takes I thirst to be historical. He even talks about dehydration as a part of the sufferings of crucifixion, and his main discussion in his commentary is on how this fulfilled prophecy, because it said that it fulfilled prophecy when Jesus said, I thirst. All right, Carson traditionally harmonizes the day and time of the crucifixion, whereas Licona thinks that John changed the day and the time of the crucifixion. Check. Carson traditionally harmonizes the temple cleansing. He considers briefly the possibility of topical narration, which would be achronological moving, but he rejects that because he says that the times seem to be pretty tight, both in John and the Synoptics, which I agree with. And he also says that theological theories about John's moving the temple cleansing neither agree with each other nor prove intrinsically convincing. This is on pages 223 to 225. He considers every objection to two temple cleansings that is commonly brought in the critical literature. He rejects them. He does say this phrase, it is not possible to regard with certainty whether there was one temple cleansing or two, but immediately goes on to add, the arguments for one are weak and subjective, while the most natural reading of the texts favors two. So clearly he's favoring the two. I mean, it's not possible to conclude with absolute certainty anything in history, so that's not the point. So he's taking the conservative harmonization view, whereas Licona leans very strongly toward John moving the temple cleansing. Check. Carson accepts Jesus breathing on his disciples. He's not sure that he actually breathed, maybe just on them, maybe breathed out or something, but the historicity of what's reported there and Jesus saying those words, the so-called Johannine Pentecost, he accepts it as historical and argues for that. Licona, in Why Are There Differences in the Gospels, says that's John's change to try to weave mention of the of Pentecost, which it's an invention theory. So check. All right, if you look at the Matthew commentary by Carson and you compare it to the John commentary, Carson traditionally harmonizes Matthew's recorded meeting in Galilee with John and Luke's recorded meeting with the male disciples in Jerusalem. He says they were different meetings and they happened separately, and goes into the arguments for that, whereas Licona's insisted that there was only one meeting that corresponded to either of these, and one set of authors or the other moved it. Check. Carson accepts Jesus' explicit declaration that he is the Messiah to the woman at the well. The reason I bring this up is that Carson points out that this means that Jesus wasn't always so averse to being explicit, and he's talking about Jesus' declarations of his own deity. So while Licona argues that the lack of explicitness of Jesus about his own messiahship is an argument against his being so explicit as to say, before Abraham was I am, Carson argues to the contrary. Check. Carson uses instances of high Christology in the synoptics to defend the recognizable historicity of the I am sayings in John with and without predicates, like before Abraham was I am, without a predicate, and I am the true vine is with a predicate. And he does this concerning their occurring within the setting in which they are reported in John, okay? Not just that somewhere, somehow, sometime Jesus said something like this, okay? And there's a big difference between using high Christology in the synoptics to defend the recognizable historicity of high Christology in John, on the one hand, and using high Christology in the synoptics to dismiss the importance of the historicity of the high Christology in John. Those are very different. I hope you can see the difference, okay? And Carson's talking about the recognizable historicity of these things in John. Check. And there is no recognizable random questioning of sayings in John, where Carson will just suddenly, throw up his hands and say, here's this thing that John reports that Jesus said. It is impossible to know from scholars. He may be, making this up, adapting some completely different saying in a different setting. Nothing like that. He even rejects the composite discourse view in John as he does for Matthew. And a composite discourse view is that there's a discourse that looks like it's recorded on a given day at a given time, but it's actually a composite of things Jesus said elsewhere. And in fact, it was reading Carson's Matthew commentary on this topic that stiffened my spine years ago. I keep expecting somebody to look this up and go, Lydia McGrew is inconsistent. So you heard it here first. I'm getting out in front of it. I've changed my mind on this. When I debated Craig Evans, I said, well, okay, if Jesus, if Matthew records composite discourses, maybe John records composite discourses, so how is the length of a discourse any more of an argument against John than against Matthew? Okay, so I was at least provisionally willing to accept the idea of a composite discourse, but Carson, who's very much in a minority on this concerning Matthew especially, convinced me otherwise, that there's really no evidence of a convention of composite discourses, and in fact that, when the person in the gospel is bracketing something in such a way that it's really clearly looking like these things were recognizably said on a given occasion, then we should take that seriously. Check, because Licona definitely thinks that Jesus' farewell discourse is a composite discourse, but even more, he says that John may be theologizing history there and so forth, not just that it's a composite. Now, what this amounts to is there is not a single issue concerning the Gospel of John where I'm challenging the views of Dr. Licona, Dr. Craig Evans, some of the views of Daniel Wallace, where Carson takes the position that they take on that issue. Not a single one. Okay? And he usually argues explicitly against that position, though of course his commentary and the article I'm about to quote were written, earlier, but he knows the positions, the critical scholarly positions, and he's explicitly rejecting them on issue after issue, or he just clearly assumes the historical position, as in the case of I Thirst. There are even additional issues where I don't know what Dr. Licona's view is. I could guess what he might say, but I haven't seen him address them specifically, where critical scholars, what conservatives would normally call liberal scholars, take a position against John's literal historicity, where Dr. Carson also addresses those and takes the conservative position and argues for it, such as the casting out from the synagogue in John 9. A lot of liberal scholars say that's an anachronism and that John is bringing in some later thing that really was not a thing at the time of Jesus, and pretending, writing as though you could get thrown out of the synagogue during Jesus' own ministry, even though he knew that wasn't the case. Carson rejects that view. But there's more. Okay, and how do I know about these other critical scholarly positions. And how did I know what to look up, in Dr. Carson's commentary? It's because I do read the commentaries. So this idea that if you disagree with Dr. Licona, it's because you're uninformed, because you don't realize that, hey, everybody's known all of these things, all of this stuff for all these years. You just don't read the commentaries. You don't have time. And that's not your job. That's not your role. So in other words, you should leave it to the experts. That's not the case for me. I know about these scholarly issues because I do read the scholarly literature and I do read the commentaries. But now here's where I'm going to read some more verbatim quotations from Dr. Carson, especially from an article called Historical Tradition in the Fourth Gospel, After Dodd, What? And I've mentioned this article before, very important article, and I'll provide a link in the show notes. It's available online because there's more. When it comes to this statement about style, remember back at the beginning, I read that quotation that ends with John has rewritten the whole, and all the examples are about these trivial things, the commonness of John's using certain conjunctions, or John not using a conjunction at all, what's called a syndeton, just putting clauses right next to one another without a conjunction and so forth. And then I said, well, maybe elsewhere he broadens this to something more than that. But he also explicitly restricts it to style issues. In other words, he's very aware of the idea that because of these style issues, we should question the historicity, the recognizable historicity of John's reportage of Jesus' words, and he blocks that. He blocks it explicitly, and that's really important because it shows just how far wrong Dr. Licona's use is of that quotation, John has rewritten the whole. All right, I'm going to start reading from Historical Tradition in the Fourth Gospel, After Dodd, What? Pages 122 to 123. This is Carson. However, although on the basis of John's language I do not take these words, this is the farewell discourse he's discussing, to be the ipsissima verba of Jesus, and although the language is that of Johannine idiom, and although there is nothing that requires or even suggests that this is all that Jesus said on this occasion, yet I cannot help noting that John presents these chapters to us as the teaching of Jesus on a certain night at a certain time in history. Now let me break here. You see what Carson's doing? He's actually just saying this isn't tape recorded. There might be some differences of style, but is blocking any attempt to generalize that to, so, maybe this is just John's theologizing history and thinking about something Jesus taught some other time and putting it in here, or an interpretation that he thinks is the right interpretation. He thinks that's what Jesus meant, and so it doesn't matter because he's inspired by the Holy Spirit. He's blocking all of that. He's strengthening the connection between John's report and Jesus' recognizable teaching on a certain night at a certain time in history. He continues, I might also be inclined to find my view reinforced by the break at the end of John 14. Far from indicating a seam, 14:31 to 15:1 evidences a momentous recollection of detail. Now what he's referring to is when Jesus says, rise, let us go. Okay, a lot of scholars have said, see, this is what happens when you're aware of the critical issues. Especially Bart Ehrman says this, that the rise, let us go is an indication of clumsy editor's work by some other editor, because later it says they went out across the brook Kidron. And so it's like, and that's several chapters later. And in his commentary, Carson specifically harmonizes this. And he's like, sometimes you say, come on, let's go, and you don't go right away. Or it might mean that they left the room and were walking, but then went across the brook later on. So it's like super realistic harmonization. So a seam would be one of those editorial awkward editorial connections. Far from indicating a seam, 1431 to 15:1 evidences a momentous recollection of detail. Jesus and his disciples leave the room in response to his quiet, "Rise, let us go." He gives it in Greek, but that's what it is in English. They leave the city, walking in several clumps. 12 men can scarcely walk in one group in the narrow streets of Old Jerusalem. This circumstance explains the description surrounding the dialogue in 16, 17 through 19. Moreover, as they pass by vineyards, Jesus finds another metaphor to use on this most awesome of nights, and he begins, "I am the true vine," 15:1. I cannot prove that it was so, but I suggest that this is a methodologically superior way to approach the hard literary evidence that we actually possess. All right, a methodologically superior way where you're taking Jesus saying, "I am the true vine," with so much literalness as recognizably having been said. Now you might have said, "I am like a vine," or "I am like the vine," or something like that. Okay. But that he's considering that Jesus may have gotten it from the fact that they were walking past vineyards. That's like as far as possible from, it is impossible to know how far John adapted Jesus' teachings. Okay, very, very far from that. And as far as the East is from the West, this is removed from the idea that John made up by thirst, and it is finished on the cross. All right, here's another quotation, important quotation, limiting this to just style. All right, still from that article. This is page 121 to 22. It's a little earlier in the article. Here's Carson. "It is often argued, or worse, presupposed, that John commonly takes some saying of Jesus which he found in the tradition and expounds it at length in such a way as to give the impression that Jesus himself had given the entire exposition. Sometimes this alleged procedure is justified on the grounds that Christian prophets regularly spoke words of the exalted Christ through the power of the Spirit, and the Church wittingly or unwittingly mingled the statements of the exalted Christ spoken through some Christian prophet with the words of Jesus during his pre-passion ministry. It is further pointed out that in at least one place, namely John 3, it is extremely difficult to ascertain where the purported words of Jesus and the words of the evangelist begin. There has recently been presented solid evidence that the creative role of prophets was much smaller than many have contended. Moreover, if in one passage John does not make it clear where Jesus stops and he begins, in virtually every other case there is no ambiguity at all about where John expects his readers to see Jesus' words finishing. This is a point that I made in The Eye of the Beholder, by the way. And this is the point about which a certain scholar wrote email to me saying I had drunk the Kool-Aid, that I'll sometimes cite about it, that it's often hard to tell where Jesus stops and John begins. He had said that, and I had said, no, one time. Okay. Back to Carson. More important, there is quite substantial evidence not only that Jesus spoke cryptically at times, and that his cryptic utterances were not properly understood until after his resurrection, exaltation, and his sending of the Paraclete, but also that John faithfully preserved the distinction between what Jesus said that was not understood and the understanding that finally came to the disciples much later. And then there's a parenthesis with a whole bunch of references in John to these asides. And I got this idea from Carson, and I've really pushed it, that the asides in John all by themselves refute this idea that John thought it was legitimate to make his interpretations appear to be coming from the mouth of Jesus historically. Back to Carson. It is not at all obvious that John is confused on this matter. One might even argue plausibly that anyone who preserves this distinction so faithfully and explicitly is trying to gain credence for what he is saying. And if he errs in this matter, it will be because of an unconscious slip, not by design. And the emphases there, like also that John faithfully preserved, unconscious slip, not by design, the emphasis there is in the original. Now, it couldn't be much clearer that Carson is drawing a bright line in the sand between any statements about, parataxis and asyndeton and how often Jesus uses certain Greek conjunctions on the one hand over here, and recognizable historicity on specific occasions over here, and is not sliding from one to the other. In fact, he's blocking that slide. All right. One last quotation. This is from the commentary again, page 54 from the Kindle edition. By constantly drawing attention to the misunderstandings of observers and disciples alike during the days of Jesus' ministry, John shows he is able to distinguish what he and others understood back then and what he came to understand only later. Indeed, he insists on the distinction. I have cataloged the data elsewhere, and this catalog constitutes a remarkably strong piece of evidence that the evangelist was self-consciously aware of the possibility of anachronism and for his own reasons studiously avoided it. So, can we conclude from John has rewritten the whole in Carson's commentary that Carson is on the side of this stuff and these things that Dr. Licona is saying about the Gospel of John that is controversial? No, absolutely not. On issue after issue, he's coming in on the other side of these issues. And he is really literally just talking about style there while defending recognizable, paraphrase, recognizable historicity. It's really, really important to know this, okay? So from every perspective, I have not been in communication with Dr. Carson. I'm not trying to read his mind. I'm using his publicly published writings on these issues, including the very commentary that Dr. Licona was quoting, that one phrase from John has rewritten the whole. And from that perspective, we can see that he should not be co-opted as supporting the dubious views of John's literal historicity that are held by Dr. Licona and some others. I'm not saying that there are not conservative labeled scholars who agree with Dr. Licona. Unfortunately, there are, and I've specifically named Dr. Craig Evans and Dan Wallace. Dan Wallace appears to have originated that one about the I thirst. Licona cites him for that, credits him with that, but not Carson. And this sort of co-opting of comments merely about style to some sort of broader agreement with these controversial views is not responsible scholarship. It's not good. It's not something that one should do. Now, if Dr. Carson did hold those views, I would still disagree with him. Okay, I'm not gonna just go with an argument, from authority. You got to agree with whatever this person thinks. But also, it's important not to just go out and grab everybody and say, oh yeah, and all these guys agree with me, so you're going to be up against all of us if you disagree with me. It's not a right thing to do when it's not an accurate portrayal of the other scholars. And I would say specifically in Carson's case, and I base it on these numerous quotations and instances, that's not accurate. So I think it's important to set the record straight there. Next time I'm planning to start talking more about why it's important that John and others did not put their own interpretations in Jesus' mouth. Even if they were inspired by God, why is it important to do as Carson notes John has done, and to separate their own interpretations from the words, recognizable words on specific occasions of the historical Jesus? Why should we care? And I think that'll be interesting, because I think, unfortunately, that used to be something that conservatives understood, but they seem to be not understanding that anymore, why that is important or why we should care. So I want to talk about that more next time, and maybe for a couple more videos. So I hope you'll come back next time to the Lydia McGrew channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.